The following contains mature content. You've been warned. From Wondery, I'm Mark Ramsey, and this is part 6, the final part, of Inside Psycho. The line stretched for miles, not only at this drive-in, but at many around the country. Police were called in to handle the gridlock. In Chicago, a freak thunderstorm caught so many Psycho ticket holders outside in line, they threatened to tear apart the theater unless the manager let them inside. Hitchcock had an idea. Buy them umbrellas. And that's what the theater did, thus guaranteeing front-page headlines in the Chicago Tribune. Among audiences, Psycho was praised and condemned in equal measure, but most important, it was talked about everywhere, by everyone. Psycho set attendance records around the world. It grossed over $9 million in the U.S. and more than $6 million internationally. Combined, that's more than $120 million today. In 1960, that was second only to Ben-Hur. But Psycho was far more profitable. Psycho would go on to become Hitchcock's all-time top moneymaker. Indeed, no film had ever before boasted so many return viewings. People came at the beginning and left at the end, again and again and again. Back in his office at Universal, Hitchcock relished the unending attention from the industry trades. It was stoked by Paramount's publicity department, whose ads proclaimed, "Psycho fever rises coast to coast." For all the anxiety, for all the worry, Hitchcock could afford a long, slow puff on that delightful cigar. He could afford a moment to relax. Once again, the spotlight was all his. He had bet it all against the better judgment of everyone around him. And now, he was a very rich man. April 17, 1961. Alfred Hitchcock was nominated for the Best Director Oscar. This time, it was no dream. He and Alma proudly walked the red carpet. It was the 33rd Academy Awards. Psycho was such a phenomenon, he hoped he would earn the prize that had escaped him 4 previous times. The show began. Minutes dragged. Finally, the Best Director category, Gina Lollobrigida is reading the names of the nominees. And now she is handed the envelope. And the winner is... She looks out over the audience. Billy Wilder for The Apartment. Billy Wilder bounds to the stage. The audience roared its approval. In his seat, Hitchcock applauded politely. Alma gripped his arm to comfort him. She knew his pain. She could feel it. Hitchcock was nominated for a Best Director Oscar 5 times. This would be the final time. It was the most important gesture of respect the Hollywood community could bestow on its own. And he would never win. Never. Privately, he would confide to Alma, "I don't understand why I've never won an Oscar. The industry looks down their noses at me." In the midst of so much reason for celebration, Hitchcock was unhappy. Many years later, in the twilight of his life, Hitchcock would receive an honorary Oscar for Lifetime Achievement. This was the award Hollywood gives its aging lions, its dinosaurs, its stallions long since put out to pasture. As Hitchcock rose to accept the honor, he knew, as everyone in the room did, that this was too little and too late. The room quieted. What he said next was one of the shortest speeches in Oscar history. Thank you very much indeed. We all enjoy putting our toe in the cold water of death, Hitchcock once said. But a little death goes a long way. May 1961, Hitchcock's office at Universal. He needed that massage right now. For all the fury over Psycho, for all the record-setting box office, for all the success, for all the money, Hitchcock was left with one horrifying thought. What now? What will you do for an encore? That's what his agent, the studio head Lou Wasserman, asked him. And the truth is, he didn't have the slightest idea. He spent some time with the studio's marketing research team. He wanted to know exactly why Psycho had become such a hit. Let's crack the code. Let's reveal the secret. Let's reverse engineer this movie so this can happen again. Because the alternative is failure. The hysteria over Psycho was becoming yesterday's news. What will you do for an encore? That encore would be 3 years in the making. That encore would be The Birds. But things were changing for Hitchcock and his studio Universal. The studio was now keeping close tabs, or as Hitchcock called it, interfering. Mr. Hitchcock, do you think we'll be out of this location by Friday? After that, we face cost overruns, you know. Sir, when Friday comes, if we're done, we're done. This kind of shadowy nagging had never happened to Hitchcock before. It was the beginning of a new phase. It was the beginning of the end. (1964), outside Hitchcock's office. Jeffrey and Stanley, Yorkshire Terriers, playing in the alley outside. 2 dogs, dear to Hitch and Alma. He even named his production company after them. How he loved those dogs. The reviews and the early box office for Hitchcock's latest film, Marnie, were in, and they were disappointing. Marnie would be a flop. He needed something warm right now. Something warm and loving and non-judgmental. He needed his beloved dogs. Hitch rose and looked out onto the lot. How could he not see it? It was right in front of his eyes. A truck had backed up over Jeffrey. He would not survive. Hitchcock wasn't right after that, not for weeks and weeks. Maybe not forever. After Psycho, Hitchcock made 6 more films. Just 6. Although he tried to develop many more. None of these was even remotely as successful or as influential as Psycho. As time passed, his health suffered, arthritis and heart trouble, and a new generation of directors splashed onto the scene, determined to make movies Hitchcock style. The legendary director was desperate for the kind of story which could tell the world and all his peers, I'm still here. I'm still Hitchcock. October 24, 1975. Jason's Restaurant, Hitchcock's favorite, the site of his celebration of the deal for Psycho more than 15 years earlier. He's in his favorite booth for lunch with actor Bruce Dern, the star of his latest movie, which was then in production, Family Plot. The movie, which would turn out to be his last. Once again, the audience was changing. In June of that year, a new kind of thriller was unleashed on the marketplace. It redefined the meaning of the term blockbuster and became, for a time, the highest-grossing movie ever made. That movie was Jaws. Both movies were made by Universal, but Jaws, made by an up-and-coming young director who worshipped Hitchcock, would gross 35 times more than Family Plot. The era of Alfred Hitchcock was over. Hey, Hitch? It wasn't uncommon for Hitchcock to fall asleep in his booth at Jason's. Hitch? Yes, Bruce. Hitch, why won't you meet Steven Spielberg? You're his idol. He just wants to sit at your feet for 5 minutes and talk with you. Steven Spielberg. Isn't that the boy who made the Fish movie? Well, Hitchcock knew very well who Steven Spielberg was. I could never sit down and talk to him because I'd look at him and feel like such a whore. Now, Bruce Dern was stunned by this. Hitch, why in the world would you, of all people, feel like a whore just by looking at Spielberg? That's when a pained look came over the old man's face. Because I'm the voice of the Jaws ride at Universal Studios theme park. They paid me $1 million, and I took it, and I did it. I'm such a whore. I can't sit down and talk to the boy who did the Fish movie. I couldn't even touch his hand. March 7, 1979. Alfred Hitchcock is the 7th recipient of the American Film Institute's Life Achievement Award. He was about to turn 80. Hollywood's biggest stars and many of his collaborators over the decades paid tribute that night. Throughout the speeches and the clips, Hitchcock was sullen, his expression vacant. He knew this was the end. In those days, the show was taped for broadcast on network TV later. Hitchcock could barely walk. He could barely stand. When he rose and moved to the podium to speak, the trip took so long, the network TV version cut away to a pre-recorded acceptance speech. When he reached the podium, Hitch looked onto the audience, his community of filmmakers. He caught the eye of one individual in particular, his wife, Alma Revel. For that moment, at least, he had an audience of one. He said, "Had the beautiful Miss Revel not accepted a lifetime contract without options as Mrs. Alfred Hitchcock some 53 years ago, Mr. Alfred Hitchcock might be in this room tonight, not at this table, but as one of the slower waiters on the floor. I share my award, as I have my life, with her." His audience of one wiped away a tear and blew him a kiss. As he left the podium, he waved goodbye. This really was goodbye. It was the last time the public would see Alfred Hitchcock. Even as Hitchcock's later movies were bombing with audiences, the legend of Psycho was growing. It was largely thanks to Psycho that audiences got into a new habit, arriving at the theater at the start of the movie. The New York Post described Psycho as the most profitable black and white film in the annals of cinema since D.W. Griffith's silent classic The Birth of a Nation. In 1977, Psycho appeared for the first time in the American Film Institute's poll of the greatest films of all time. The latest version of that list from 2007 shows Psycho ranked number 14. And in AFI's list of the 100 most thrilling American films, Psycho is number 1. One notch ahead of number 2, Jaws. The critics came around. Time magazine, which had called Psycho gruesome and a heavy-handed creak and shriek movie in 1960, saw it differently by 1965 when it praised Roman Polanski's movie Repulsion as in the classic style of Psycho. Bosley Crowther at the New York Times initially regarded Psycho as unsubtle and even old-fashioned. But by the end of the year, that same critic named Psycho as one of the year's 10 best, calling it bold, expert, and sophisticated. Why the change of heart? Well, Hitchcock biographer Stephen Rebello writes this: beneath the shock and suspense tactics lies a reservoir of profound understanding of the fragility of life. Lurking beneath the adventure and thrills is Hitchcock's outrage toward the cruelty we inflict upon each other in the name of love. Maybe Psycho was Hitchcock's amusement park haunted house ride, built for thrills and chills, screams and laughter, aimed always to please. The more successful and legendary the movie, the more difficult it is to make a sequel. And that has never stopped anyone in Hollywood from trying. It took 22 years for a sequel to Psycho to materialize. Anthony Perkins refused to reprise his role as Norman Bates. That's when Christopher Walken was about to step in. Tony changed his mind. There were 2 more sequels to come, both starring Anthony Perkins, one made for cable TV. In 1998, director Gus Van Sant was hot. He had just made the hugely successful Oscar-nominated movie Good Will Hunting with 2 new young talents, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Now he could do anything he wanted. And what he did next was one of the great missteps in Hollywood history. Was it chutzpah? Lunacy? Was there something bad in the food at the Beverly Hills Polo Lounge the day the deal was done? Van Sant would remake the original Psycho and do it virtually shot for shot. This wouldn't be a different take on Psycho. No, this would essentially be the same take. Why would the audience want this, you might ask? Exactly. Vince Vaughn had the unenviable task of stepping into the shoes of Anthony Perkins, and Anne Hesh was cast as Marion Crane. This Psycho bombed with audiences and critics alike. It was awarded 2 Golden Raspberry Awards, including Worst Remake and Worst Director. Anne Hesh was nominated for Worst Actress, but lost to the Spice Girls. It must have been their year. One critic wrote that the only reason to watch it was to see Anne Hesh being assassinated. Back in 1960, the car containing Marion Crane's body is famously pulled from a swamp. In the original Psycho's final scene. It cost Hitchcock $150 to have the engine cleaned, and then the car disappeared. Until 1998. The movie was Halloween H20, the 20th anniversary sequel to the John Carpenter classic Halloween. The star was Jamie Lee Curtis, the daughter of Janet Leigh. And Janet was in the cast too. She played a character named Norma. Janet's final scene has her walking to her car to drive off into the sunset. You see the car, a suspiciously old one, and you hear the hints of Psycho in the soundtrack. The car? It's a 1957 Ford Custom 300 sedan, the very one from Psycho. Even the plates are the same, NFB 418. NFB, that's for Norman F. Bates, where the F is a reference to St. Francis, the patron saint of birds. The influence of Psycho is everywhere in movies today. In Brian De Palma's classic 1976 movie Carrie, the heroine is a student at Bates High School. Sam Loomis is Marion's lover and the man who finally stops Norman. He also boasts one of the most popular names in movie history. Dr. Sam Loomis tried to stop serial slasher Michael Myers in 5 Halloween movies and 2 sequels. Both Billy Loomis and his mother figure prominently in the Ghostface killings in Wes Craven's Scream series. On the whole, Psycho has been mimicked, parodied, and lampooned dozens of times. And in 2017, for the final season of A&E's TV series Bates Motel, we meet a new Sam Loomis and another new character, played by pop star Rihanna. That character's name? Marion Crane. After more than 55 years, Bates Motel, a TV series spun from the movie Psycho. What would Tony Perkins, the original Norman Bates, think about that? He would probably be flattered. That's what his longtime friend Paul Jasmine told me. Tony had such a dark sense of humor. And what about the inspiration for Psycho, Ed Gein? What about his influence on popular culture today? Without Ed, we wouldn't have Psycho, and without Psycho, we wouldn't have any movies featuring knife-wielding fanatics. No Michael Myers, no Jason Voorhees, no American Psycho Patrick Bateman, not even Chucky. Of course, Ed inspired more than knife killers. He was also the basis for Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs and its sequels and spin-offs. But you can see Ed Gein's purest inspiration in another small movie that exploded onto the scene and became one of the most successful independent films of all time. Made on the dusty roads of Central Texas in 1974 with a young crew and an unknown cast, it would become one of the most terrifying movies ever made. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And as in Psycho, there's the dried corpse of the family matriarch, still home, propped up in a chair, waiting. There's a story that's never told. It never made the LA Times or the tabloid press. The flacks at Universal squelched the news. Studios could do that in those days. Did it even happen? April 30, 1980. Alfred Hitchcock's death is splashed across every newspaper. April 30. In German folklore, that date is also known as Walpurgisnacht, Witch's Night, a satanic rite marked by blood sacrifice. As Universal awakened that day, there was a solemn hush over the usual morning bustle. Hitchcock's office door on the lot was closed, and at the door, armfuls of flowers and notes from admirers and collaborators alike. This was her first day at work. I can't tell you her name. Nobody knows her name. Nobody wants to know. She had been hired to do the hard work of safeguarding assets at Universal. She was a security guard, mid-40s, kind, motherly. She had the night shift. Her job was to tour the lot, checking locks, looking for trespassers. She had just arrived at 6 p.m. From her perch near the studio entrance, she watched the artists, technicians, and suits stream out at the end of the day. Universal is a vibrant, energetic city during the day, but at night, it can be black and quiet as a morgue. Every 2 hours, she had to make her rounds. She walks to the security cart, revs up the battery, and zips out across the lot to check sites off her list. This was the midnight round. Over there is stage 28, site of the original Phantom of the Opera, the one with Lon Chaney. It still contained the set. That stage was always rumored to be haunted, but those were just rumors, she was told. Somehow, rumors are more scary at midnight when you're all alone. Over the hill she drove. Up next, the Psycho House, still standing then, just as it stands there today. She parks and walks up the long steps. She checks the door. Uh-oh. That was supposed to be locked. It's pitch black in here. No lights. She had never been in this building before. Most of the structures at Universal were facades, false fronts, no interiors at all. But this was different. She waved around the flashlight. She could see. This building had 4 walls, like a real house. What was that? It seems to be coming from behind that door to the cellar. She stares into the dark. Nothing. The flashlight finds a bulb hanging overhead. Doesn't work. What was that? The light finds something. A wood chair. In it, a figure. Facing the wall. Gray hair tied into a bun. "Ma'am?" she calls. She steps towards the figure. She reaches out to touch her shoulder. The figure rises, turning slowly. She steps back. A mask like death, leathery skin, lips sewn shut, holes for eyes. A suit. The body of an old woman. Naked, rotting flesh. She felt a knife rip through her belly, sliding all the way down her torso. She was conscious of hanging by her heels from a chain in the ceiling. She was conscious of her guts slipping into a tub beneath her. The figure bent down to look into her eyes. They were dripping with blood. The last thing she heard. They'll see. They'll see, and they'll know. And they'll say, why? She wouldn't even harm a fly. from Wondery. This has been a 6-part deep dive inspired by the story behind an unforgettable classic movie. This is part 6, the final chapter of Inside Psycho. We'd like to learn more about you. Please complete a short survey at wondery.com/survey and subscribe to this show on iTunes, Stitcher, the Wondery app on Android, or wherever you listen. It's free. For more information and to comment on this show, visit our website, wondery.com/insidepsycho. If you like the show, we'd love you to give us a 5-star rating and a review. It helps others go inside Psycho too. Written and narrated by Mark Ramsey. Sound design and editing by Jeff Schmidt. Produced by Mark Ramsey Media. Executive producers Jeffrey Glazer and Hernan Lopez for Wondery. Please thank us by rewarding our sponsors with your support. Tell your friends about this show, and Mother thanks you.